Yeah, I'm Matt Johnson from the University of Manchester, and we tried to kind of put this panel together. So I'd like to say thank you to Karen and to Lorena and to Janice and Rodolfo for joining us. So it means a lot to have a broader perspective on this. This is kind of a work in progress. So this is kind of some initial theoretical perspectives that we're putting forward, a little bit of empirical data. It was interesting, Ian was making the point about platform, whether platform workers will kind of exist in the future. So I'm kind of late to the party on platform work, and the party's already over. So whether this is a sustainable thread of work is another thing. So this is part of a bigger project on cities, understanding what labour markets are like in different cities around the world, two of which are Manchester and Buenos Aires. So that's kind of one component of it, but it's also building a little bit on Christina's PhD work. So she did some work on this a few years ago in Manchester and Brighton and London. So that's kind of the background to it. I'll get on to the next one. So we're interested in kind of precarious work in general, in urban areas, but particularly around urban platform work. It's something that's come up in almost all of our cities. The role of platform work, food delivery, ride hailing, kind of keeping the city going, keeping the city moving, creating employment opportunities, but obviously not necessarily very good ones. But particularly we're interested in the kind of role of labour unrest, broadly defined, where it arises, why it arises, what forms it takes, and what kind of impact and legacies they have. So we see these kind of protests arising, but then what do they turn into? Do they lead to kind of meaningful institutional change or more kind of systemic organizing? And also the role of power. What kind of different types of power do we see? Are we, kind of seeing any significant consolidation of power among workers? So it's across a number of platforms in the two cities. So we've got Rappi, Pedidos Ya, Deliveroo, Stuart, which is Just Eat. So Stuart is kind of like the parent company of Just Eat in the UK, Uber Eats. And then we've also seen some kind of interesting people talking about cooperatives, but these kind of ethical platforms that are starting to come into the market, these kind of high-end niche platforms that we're slightly suspicious of. So the first part, what we'll be kind of mostly talking about today, is interviews with kind of experts in the field in both the cities. And then the next phase, once we get the ethical approval, is to go and actually speak to workers. What's their kind of everyday experience of kind of navigating this terrain, and whether they are involved in the union, and what their kind of attitudes towards unionization might be. So this was kind of the start point, was recognizing that despite all these challenges that you have amongst platform workers, kind of isolation, fragmentation, algorithmic control, platform workers can and do organize. They do mobilize, sorry, I should say. They do protest, they do take part in various kind of strikes, logouts, shitstorming, if I can say that.
Very technical term.
Exactly. So they do, despite all these challenges, they do mobilize, they do kind of collectively act. And some perspectives on this are suggesting that the kind of the experience of work, the labour process, the particular grievances and triggers that are kind of inherent to the platform labour process is where that solidarity is formed. So that's kind of one perspective. There's also some, this is kind of a presentation that Alex Wood did over the summer, a survey that they did showing that platform workers are positively predisposed towards trade unions. They think they're a good thing generally. They would be happy to be in one. And also, the more dependent they are on platform work, the more likely it is they are to seek out voice. So if it becomes kind of their regular job, a long-term thing, the more likely it is they are to seek out voice. So there are some kind of interesting foundations there. I think what we're kind of interested in is whether these can be sustained. What happens after that initial strike, that protest, that big demonstration, what happens next? So it's kind of what comes afterwards. Do we see workers kind of building solidarity through the mobilization? Is it purely this event of coming together that forms a kind of collective action over the long term? That's one perspective, but then Jane McAlevey would argue that that's not enough. It's kind of systemic, it's more long-term, it's a gradual process, it involves a lot of resources, kind of boots on the ground to really build lasting power. This isn't something that's just delivered through a one-off event, a one-off protest or a demonstration. So there's kind of multiple ways in which this might develop. So the reason we've kind of focused in here on Argentina and the UK is that there is I guess a recent tradition of unrest among platform workers. So colleagues at Leeds have done surveys and kind of data gathering from secondary sources, and Argentina and the UK do stand out as kind of significant sites of labour unrest. So around 100 events, and this is across all platforms. This includes kind of, you know, task workers as well as spatially fixed food delivery and ride hailing. But they make up nearly kind of 20% of all of the protest events that they surveyed. So some definite concentrations in those two locations. But what we see is they're quite intense. They can be big scale, you know, really significant, get a lot of attention, but quite short-lived. They can kind of fizzle out quite quickly. So this was kind of a reflection from an Argentinian colleague, was that it's quite normal to get your voice heard, you take it to the streets. That's kind of just a default thing. People organize and mobilize and get out onto the streets. In terms of a bit of background, union membership generally is a bit higher in Argentina than the UK, not massively so, but associational power is quite limited in both countries. So the union's having a difficult time of actually kind of leveraging any power to secure any significant concessions from employers or from the state, but it's really messy and complex. Once you get into the kind of the ground level, the city level stuff, it's much more kind of fragmented and contested than that. So some of the events that we've seen in both countries, so this on the on the left hand side, this was Deliveroo riders in Manchester. So they had a kind of ride out protest in the middle of town in 2019. So this is pre-pandemic. IWGB were kind of involved in that strike, as well as some other, you know, kind of looser networks. And then we also have the APP riders in Buenos Aires delivering the formal request to form a trade union at the Ministry of Labour. So there's certainly some precedents here. We're kind of moving into the phase now of understanding what happens after that. You know, what happens in the wake of these intense mobilizations. So we see a definite kind of trend towards bottom-up responses to precariousness, and some of that is certainly explained by the labour process if we take that lens. So it's quite common, seem like quite minor things, but cumulatively, you know, people get tired and get pissed off with this kind of thing, having to wait at the restaurant because the food's not ready, not having access to bathrooms. Safety and security is always a problem, particularly in the pandemic when the streets were quiet, riders were out and getting knocked off their bikes and getting their bikes stolen and all kinds of things. Tech problems is a recurring one, late payments. Also, more recently, we see a kind of shift towards, even though fuel prices are going up, favouring cars and scooters because they're so much faster. So the cycle couriers, you know, maybe who all they can afford is a push bike, not getting anywhere near as many jobs because they just can't do it as quick as the cars or the e-bikes or the scooters. And we see a tentative move from kind of embryonic to active solidarity. So we see this kind of low-level mutual aid, mutual support, giving advice to other individual riders and drivers. How to get reactivated is quite a big one. So you see a lot of that online, people giving advice and tips on how to get reactivated or offering to take kind of grievances on their behalf. We see the emergence of these kind of pop-up solidarity stops. So people can go and get their bike fixed, they can get some maintenance, they can charge their phone, but also it's a chance for them to meet other riders. They can talk to each other, they can talk to trade unions if they're there. And again, this kind of more direct action, the strikes, the protest and the shitstorming. So kind of publicizing when restaurants are not letting them use the bathroom, or when they've got awful management or awful wait times, and that can have an effect. But I think what we're seeing is this is more about surviving. This is kind of getting through this very difficult period post-pandemic, when people now with the cost of living aren't spending as much as they were perhaps during the pandemic. So it's kind of finding enough work to survive. So this isn't really contesting or resisting in any significant way. It's just, you know, finding a way to get through. So this can include kind of couch surfing, so you're not traveling big distances to and from work, sleeping rough, taking any orders that come. So whereas previously people might have been a bit more reluctant to take long distances or low value orders, they take whatever work they can. So a lot of the discussion online is about the kind of oversupply of riders. That's the big issue. It's not necessarily the algorithmic stuff. It's not necessarily the platform as such. It's just there's far too many riders and not enough work. So the market dynamics are kind of really shifting. Riders and drivers having multiple profiles. So they're kind of setting up more than one, you know, account across and within platforms, loaning and renting their accounts. So if they can't make it into work, they will rent their account to someone else for the day. And a big thing, particularly in the UK, is modifying the e-bikes. So getting them kind of de-restricted and deregulated so they go faster. So there are certain restrictions on how fast and how powerful the e-bikes can be in the UK, but there's lots of stuff online about how to get them chipped and deactivated so they go, you know, almost as fast as a kind of petrol powered bike.
No, I don't know.
Okay, was someone trying to get in?
Yeah,
Oh,
but
sorry.
lost.
Okay, so I'll just quickly kind of get onto the trade union dynamics, and I think I'll leave the detail up there. I won't kind of go into all of it, but I think what's interesting comparing the UK and Argentina is that I guess the fragmentation in the UK means that the smaller indie unions such as the IWGB, you know, 6,500 members versus someone like the GMB, a general union, much bigger. The fragmentation means they can kind of weirdly coexist, so they can kind of play off each other a little bit. So the IWGB is seen as much more grassroots, bottom up, militant. They can kind of coexist alongside the GMB, who are also trying to organize platform workers, because they can position themselves as doing slightly different things. So they appeal to workers in slightly different ways. So the IWGB has taken litigation on health and safety, on employee status, on collective bargaining, but they're getting much more localized. So they're really picking up local issues and trying to scale them up, whether that's particular brands, particular delivery platforms, particular restaurants, and trying to kind of replicate that, you know, neighborhood to neighborhood, city to city. And they see themselves as like the authentic alternative to the GMB. The GMB started in quite a similar way. They were taking employment tribunal case. They were arguing for collective bargaining, but they've ended up in a much more kind of partnership space. So they now have recognition deals with Uber and Deliveroo. They're looking at kind of self-employed plus arrangements with Hermes, which is like parcel delivery. So they've gone much more for the kind of top-down strategy, recruiting and servicing. But they see their kind of institutional resources, their legitimacy as their selling point. You know, we can do your insurance stuff, we can get you reactivated, we can do the servicing and all that kind of regular trade union stuff. So there's some interesting kind of tensions playing out there. The case in Argentina, this is kind of very complex. But I think what we start to see here is it's quite a winner takes all model. So even though you have these very kind of dynamic bottom up, sorry, no, it's okay. The dynamic sort of bottom-up tensions that form the unions, that form these mobilizations, the end goal really is to be the recognized union within that sector, is to achieve the collective bargaining agreement, to get a seat at the table and move kind of up that institutional value chain, which is what APP have been kind of pushing for over the last few years. So they're really moving towards that kind of single recognition deal across the sector that will give them the kind of institutional credibility, if you like, to represent platform workers across the sector. So that's kind of Angel will no doubt pick up on some of this in the questions. So I think it's kind of a question of what this means. Do these mobilizations, are they successful? The correlation between kind of labor unrest and actual regulatory reforms or significant breakthroughs in collective bargaining is not straightforward. There doesn't seem to be a particularly strong link between the two. It's much more patchy, it's much more fragmented, it's much more short-lived than we might assume. And I think what's interesting is, in comparison to some organizations or networks like Los Deliveristas in New York, where you had a real confluence of multiple actors. You had kind of academics, you had civil society, you had politicians, workers, everybody kind of working in a loose coalition. That's where you see some significant breakthroughs. So the workers on their own, the trade unions on their own are really struggling. So it seems to be where you kind of have a confluence of different institutional actors coming together is perhaps the way forward, certainly at the city level. But I think we also need to be aware of platform counter mobilization. They have got resources, they will find money to push back on any kind of strong regulation at the city level. So it's on that slightly depressing note, we can probably finish off there.
Comments? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. That's very interesting to see. And I don't do any work on platform workers, but it's so interesting to sort of learn a little bit more about the ways that they're organizing. And we touched on this a little bit in the group yesterday, but I just wanted to ask you, and I realize you haven't done the interviews with the actual workers yet, but whether you expect to see that the specific strategies that they use to get by and cope with their everyday realities is playing into undermining their actions to collectivize and take more sort of organized action, and when there's a tension between coping strategies for the everyday and these broader mobilization movements that you sort of were talking to in the beginning might have those sort of pushes towards change. So just reflect on that, perhaps would be interesting.
Thank you. And I apologize if I can't articulate this question the way I want to. But your presentation speaks most closely to what I'm struggling with. And I'm talking about the intersection between these digital platforms and then forms of worker organization. And I wonder have you all heard of unit.com? Yeah. Okay, for those of you who didn't know, let me, and Janice, at the end, you can help me too. So I've run into this situation where there are worker organizers who are organizing outside of the traditional union context. So they are not employed by a union, they're not subject to regulate. I mean, they work at Amazon, for instance. And they go to a digital platform called unit.com, right? Which then provides all these resources for mobilization and charges the workers then a percentage of whatever contract they end up with if they get one at the employer. So I wonder, does it help me to think of independent worker organizers as informalized workers or workers in an informal sector, or how to view them and their precarity? Because it seems to me, although I don't know much about unit.com, that unlike trade unions who are regulated against discrimination and other things, you've got this platform that seems a little suspect to me, although we can talk about if it's a good thing or bad thing. But so is it useful to think of organizers as informalized work? And how would we think about whether or not digital platforms are good or not good for worker mobilization or new forms of worker mobilization? And this would be, of course, with communities who feel like they're outside of the trade unions, desire to represent them, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I hope that word salad somehow.
No,
Yeah,
good
okay.
question. Yeah. Behind you.
Have a somewhat related question. So you talk about real power. I quite like that. You channel
It's Jane's work,
channel
not mine.
Jane McAlevey,
Yeah.
and raise this critical question. So there's mobilization, but is there real power? So I don't know, it reminds me a bit of an organization called FAO in Berlin. It's an anarchist union outside the official trade unions. As far as I can tell, you know that they have built power when they've kind of expanded the left-wing scene, because they can't build market power or, you know, most other kinds of power. So there's kind of a network of different initiatives, activist groups that they are part of, and people kind of move between them depending on what they're up to. I wonder how it would look with IWGB or with the Argentinian unions. Thanks.
Anybody else? Okay, Angel.
Right. Do we need the microphone or just?
No,
should
no,
pick it
no, not
from-
up there,
yeah.
you don't. But let's make sure you can be seen in the camera.
Yeah, we're both.
Okay, great.
We're good.
Okay.
All right, great. And you'll have Christina come in?
Yes.
And you- Okay,
Yes.
great.
Well, regarding the first question, Sarah, about what are our expectations in terms of we want to talk with the workers in this second phase of the project. I would say that it might be interesting to understand, these dynamics in terms of why they want to participate in maybe in these emerging trade unions in the unions or not. In the case of Argentina, might be interesting for two reasons. One of them is that inflation is obviously a huge problem nowadays. So if you think in comparative terms, platform works is still a good option for them. So to some point, that might be disencouraging the need for organizing or the need for go to the streets and organize the strikes. And it seems that this has been one of the reasons why the landscape of the Argentinian case looks quite calm in the last 2 years after the pandemic, during and after the pandemic. And the other one is, the migration dynamics are also important. One of the things is that most of the delivery workers were migrants or Venezuelans, and they come from a very traumatic experience in their country. So some of them are quite reluctant to trade unions, to say in a way. So this kind of dynamics, I would say that will be important to try to pick up what is happening in these dynamics. Second question. Workers organizers as informal work. I don't know what to say about this actually. I don't know if Christina has some comments about it first, and I can comment something later.
Yeah, I can pick up here actually. Well, thank you very much for mentioning this new kind of website or platform for informal organization. It also feels quite ambiguous to me, as you describe it, especially because if we don't have mandatory rules on industrial relation laws in many of European countries and in the UK as well, we do have to respect some standards in terms of representation. So can you hear me well, or is there any? Okay. So in terms of representation, so in order to be able to do collective bargaining with an employer, you need to be a registered union, you need to respect some specific features, such as independency, for instance. And it would be interesting to see how these platforms or these agents that pretend to organize and to represent or to help in organize can demonstrate their independency, especially if then they claim a percentage of what they gain. I mean, because if so difficult to maybe trace them back, we could also expect that there's some employers like lying behind them. So I wouldn't be surprised by that, especially in respect of how many times we hear of yellow unions lying behind some like pretending to be formal and independent unions. So I don't know. I mean, with Matt and Angela as well, we also try to go on the forums that that workers and riders use in order to collectivize, in order to discuss between each other. So one, for instance, might be Reddit. So I think that the means are already there. Although if we talk specifically of riders in the streets rather than the online, I mean, from my research, what I looked at, it was that the most effective way of collectivizing was to talking in the street, was to be in the places where riders were waiting, where riders were angry to wait for new orders. So I don't know, I would look at suspicion to this kind of ways, but it should be interesting to study them more, like this kind of platform. So thank you very much for the indication. So we might go and look forward to that.
Well, your question about power, I would say that actually I was thinking about that yesterday in Dr. Workshop. We have a very interesting conversation with an Italian researcher actually about the case of Italy, because it was produced like a convergence between an emerging trade union and the traditional or well-established trade union in the case of Italy. And we were talking about if we can understand this as a way or as a decision from this emerging trade union as a new tool to gain institutional power in order to be allowed to bargaining collectively. Okay, we were talking about institutional power. Some of the literature said that these workers have a structural power. Simon Joyce said that no, it's not a structural power, it's associational power. But the discussion what we have been staying in the last couple of months is about that if we can really say that mobilizing experiences are associational power in the mid-long term. And I would say that, okay, we have the case of Italy in which it was produced this virtuous convergence between this emerging trade union and the more traditional one. But in the case of the UK, between the IWGB and the GMB, there was no convergence possible, at least in the short term. And in the case of Argentina, it looks like this emerging trade union is trying to displace the traditional one in order to gain the right to, the union recognition and represent workers in collective bargaining. So some point we have some successful cases, as in the case of Italy, but most of the cases are still cases of internal disputes among the trade union movement. So all these debates obviously are related with the problem of institutional power, associational power, and we are quite suspicious about it.
We just need to wrap up when you're, so let's just try to take the questions quickly so that we can get to Rodolfo. I want to make sure we don't come up. Did you have a question? Oh, okay.
No.
I
do
know,
have a question.
I know Karen does, right? So let's go to the two here. And
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and what I found most interesting, one of the very interesting points is the fact that a lot of the deviant behavior goes into coping strategies or strategies that are about surviving in this context and not necessarily opposing, protesting, organizing, etc. And it, of course, though he didn't mention his name, Gora Boy, it reminds a lot of his, well, the tactics he describes in his manufacturing concern, so we're making our games, and then he's very clear about the ambiguous nature of these games, and I was wondering, well, if you can confirm this, I mean, to the extent that that these games contribute to a very smooth running of this work. So it's actually contributes to stabilize also this kind of exploitative strategies. Or if you see perhaps, I mean, who are the people who are, is it perhaps distributed unevenly, so that is a group of people who are more into this kind of survival strategies and another people who are more organizing, or if it's rather the same who are actually doing both very intensively. So
yeah,
good question. Okay, so I'll just say, if you can make your answers
as short as possible. Yeah.
So my question might start where Karen ended. I'm not sure, but pre-pandemic, at least, I can recall a couple of conversations with unionists in the United States who were organizing Uber workers and really talked about the difficulties between those who are working for Uber and trying to make a full-time living out of that versus much more casual relationship to the platform, and that a lot of the difficulties in actually organizing had to do with those casual workers. So it's a little bit in the spirit of Tammy's segmenting the workforce, although in this case, not necessarily around race and gender, though it could be. I don't know enough about the demographics. But anyway, just curious if that's a dynamic that you've heard.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because it's not only things have gone quiet from the perspective of kind of organizing and trade union kind of expansion. So does that mean there's nothing happening, or the trade unions have not been affected? But it's also, I think, a question then, do management think, oh, well, everybody's happy because they found these ways of coping, they're kind of surviving just about, or the ones that aren't happy leave and go do something else. So because everything's kind of gone quiet, it's difficult to know what's happening kind of under the surface. That's, I guess, the next part of it. I think, the segmentation point is really important, and that plays out kind of across and within the cities. So Manchester's a really strange case because it's a lot of students, but a lot of migrants, but quite a transient kind of throughput into that labour market. So the people that Christina spoke to a few years ago, we've had real struggles to get hold of them. So we don't know whether they're still in the industry, whether they've organised or anything. Whereas I guess maybe in Buenos Aires, it's perhaps a slightly more captive group because the migrant workers are quite dependent and that they struggle to move about and do other things. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out in the two cities, the way in which it's stratified and segmented, and what strategies they use. So yeah.